What I'm looking at today is something that until very recently I had 3 bottles of in my collection, and that's probably about all you need to know. This is Ardbeg 10. For many people, even a lot of people that have never even tried it, this whisky is going to need no introduction, and that's because Ardbeg is a truly iconic brand and has a rather legendary reputation. People often say that Islay make the most intensely flavoured of all whisky, and I don't think you'd be too far wrong if you said that Ardbeg is perhaps the most intensely flavoured of all Isleys. But it also has to be said that Ardbeg has such a cult following these days that it can actually be near impossible or completely impossible to find any of the special releases at anything anywhere near a sensible price. In my opinion, that cult following is partly a result of some of the really exceptional bottlings that the distillery were releasing around the time of their reopening, including the absolutely incredible 17-year-old Ardbeg. And the reason why some of those bottlings released just after the reopening was so exceptional is because Ardbeg at the time, like a lot of single malt distilleries, were putting a lot of very well aged stock into their age statement whiskies, which were much older than the age stated on the label. And they did this for a couple of reasons. One, because they had a lot of aged stock laying around, so they were able to do it. And secondly, is to add a certain level of quality and prestige to their newly reopened brand. Sadly, it's not the case anymore, and I think that the current offerings from Ardbeg, the average age in the bottle is very close, if not bang on, to the age statement on the label. And because of that, the expressions that you can buy today are very different to what you could get 20 years ago. But I think that Ardbeg is still a wonderful distillery, and I think that the 10-year-old that we're going to be looking at today is probably the best bang for your buck whisky that you can buy. So let's have a quick look at the label, details that they've given us. Ardbeg single malt whisky, guaranteed 10 years old, non-chill filtered. Now, I don't believe that it says anywhere on the box or the label that this is natural colour, but I'm almost certain that it is. It's a shame that they don't tell us explicitly, but in my own personal experience, the colour of Ardbeg 10-year-old does tend to fluctuate quite a lot. I've had some bottles of Ardbeg 10-year-old which have been literally almost completely clear. This one here is a very pale colour. So from how pale it is and the fact that the colour does vary quite a bit batch to batch, I'd say it's almost certainly not coloured. And another interesting thing, this is a glass that I've been drinking before I started recording, and I haven't added any water to this at all, and you might be able to see that it's actually quite cloudy already. Without any added water, there's already quite a bit of haze there. So the level of filtration that's happening at Ardbeg must be very low, which is another great thing. Hats off to Ardbeg. So one of the things that I really like about Ardbeg 10-year-old is that it's both sweet and dry at the same time. It not only looks a little bit like a really good white wine, but it's also got that lovely characteristic that you get in really good white wines, where you've got those lovely sweet and dry notes that balance and complement and contrast each other so well. And one of the first things that immediately leaps out of the glass at you whenever you're nosing Ardbeg 10-year-old, or most of the Ardbeg range to be fair, is a beautiful dry, ashy, smoky peatiness. And it's not a sweet, easy peat that you get in some Islay whisky. It's really a hard, dry, ashy, brittle, almost aggressive peat. And if you're a fan of that sort of thing, the level of peat that you get in Ardbeg is really something special. There's also quite a lot of fruit in there as well. In particular, I'm getting lots of notes of lemon and a nice sweet pear note. A little bit of vanilla, which I'm not sure was there in bottlings of Ardbeg 10 sort of around 5 years ago, but I do suspect that they might have started using a high proportion of first fill fresh bourbon casks in this, which partly because of that extra presence of vanilla on the nose, and also because the colour is that little bit richer and more golden than it was a few years ago. But that's not a bad thing. Getting lots of earthy, soily notes on the nose, again coming through from the peat. From the intensity of the peat, as well as the sharp fruitiness of the spirit, you can really tell that this is a young whisky. And by young, I don't mean extremely young or immature. You can tell that it really is a 10-year-old spirit. But that's a good thing, because in your heavily peated whiskies, you don't want the whisky to spend too many years in the cask and lose that big hit of intense peat. Getting quite some acrid, plasticky, almost chemically notes coming through on the nose, and I think that's a combination, mostly the peat, but also a little bit from the spirit as well. And I don't mean this in a bad way at all. It's actually a flavour profile that I really like. In particular, there's a note there on the nose which I personally associate with old cassette tapes, and it's not something that you see too often, but it tends to be a note that you find in peated whiskies, but I always get that when I drink the Ardbeg 10-year-old. Now, a lot of these flavours that I'm describing, some of you may think that it sounds fantastic if you're a true peat head, but a lot of people might be thinking that it doesn't sound particularly pleasant. Things like plastic, acrid and soil, these aren't typically things that we choose to eat. And I think because of that, a lot of people say that whiskies like Islay in general, and especially your heavily peated whiskies like Ardbeg, a lot of people say that they're not beginner whiskies, and I don't really think that's the case. I think that some beginners, especially if they have a more adventurous palate, they might pick up something like a Laphroaig or an Ardbeg and really fall in love with it straight away. But I think the important thing is not to limit yourself or others in their discovery of whisky. Even if you don't think that you're going to like something like Ardbeg, if you get the chance to try it, you really must, because it's a really unique and interesting experience. And even if you don't like it, at least you know. And even if you don't like it, I would still suggest giving peated whisky a try every now and again, just to see if your palate has changed at all. So I think one of the things with a developing palate is that quite often there are foods and drinks and flavours that a lot of people might not necessarily like on their first exposure to them, but as you get a little bit of familiarity with those flavours, you start to appreciate them a bit more. It becomes less of a shock, and over time and exposure to something, you can really start to enjoy it. So I would definitely say, don't limit yourself with things like this. Get out there and try as much as you can. Really is a really complex nose, especially for 10 years old. It's a really phenomenal whisky. I'm also getting some notes of smoked ham and smoked ham with black pepper, and also some black coffee notes as well. Also some hearty notes of cereal grist. It's always nice when you can taste the barley in a whisky, and of course in this case it would be a heavily peated barley. There is a reoccurring note on the nose, and it's something a little bit salty, briny and a little bit mineral. There's a big note in there that I associate with salted licorice, which I think is a Dutch thing. I think they call it drop. It's a bit of a Dutch speciality. Any Dutch viewers out there, you'll probably have to forgive my pronunciation, but salted licorice definitely in there, and I'm also getting some notes of smoked fish as well. So let's see how it tastes. So the first thing that you taste, as you might expect, is a big hit of dry, acrid peat, but it's balanced beautifully with some really nice fruitiness. I think I would describe the fruitiness as something like sweetened grapefruit juice, but it really changes all the time. I'm also getting some lovely vanilla notes on the palate. It's beautifully smooth and creamy, not a cloying sweetness from the bourbon casks, but it's just another perfectly balanced facet of this wonderful whisky. But that sweetness is always in this eternal conflict with this really nice ashy peatiness and a little bit of a peppery, almost chilly, bitter edge as well. And I think I probably mentioned on the nose that I was getting some black coffee notes, and I'm getting that on the palate too. And I don't mean cheap, thin, instant coffee. I mean like really good, freshly ground, properly made coffee. And I'd say something like a Kenyan, something bright and fruity, that sort of black coffee. Really nice. There's also a really nice sooty, peaty note to this whisky. It's kind of like sticking your head into a chimney where they've been burning dry old peat. And again, a nice licorice note at the end of the palate as well. As for the finish, it's a long finish. some lovely sooty, smoky peat, some lemon and dry gristiness, and some nice mineral, astringent black coffee notes on there as well. It's really a phenomenal whisky, and the thing that I love so much about it isn't necessarily the intensity of the peat, but it's the way that everything is so perfectly balanced and complementing and contrasting with everything else that's going on. It's really one of my favourite whiskies. So what grade am I going to give to Ardbeg 10-year-old? I'm going to go with a B+. And I really was a bit torn about this because I wanted to go a little bit higher. I think it probably deserves a B++, but I want to keep things simple on here, don't want to get too complicated, so I'm going to go with a really high B+. So how does Ardbeg in the Ardbeg 10-year-old compare to the other South Shore Islers? So with Islay whisky, people quite often talk about the Kildalton 3, so you've got Ardbeg, Laphroaig and Lagavulin all situated on the South Shore, and traditionally that's what people have tended to think of when they're talking about heavily peated Islay whisky. So Laphroaig, as a lot of you all know, used to call themselves the most intensely flavoured of all Scotch whisky, which, aside from being really rude to all of their sister distilleries on Islay, I think it's pretty much incorrect. I would say that Ardbeg 10-year-old, especially compared to Laphroaig 10-year-old, even the cask strength, it's a more intensely flavoured and especially more intensely peated whisky, but it's also a drier peatiness, and it's a more complex and more refined whisky as well. There's a lot more going on in Ardbeg 10-year-old than there is in most Laphroaigs. And I think that the reason for that, and one of the key differences between Ardbeg and Laphroaig, is that Laphroaig tend to mature their 10-year-old and most of their standard whiskies in first fill bourbon casks, and that gives Laphroaig a huge sweetness, which you don't get in Ardbeg, which I would guess is probably matured in refill bourbon casks. That sweetness that you get in the average Laphroaig really subdues and tones down a lot of the other flavours, and that's one of the reasons why I would tend to go for an Ardbeg rather than a Laphroaig most of the time. And compared to Lagavulin, Lagavulin is a distillery that chooses generally to present itself as a more aged and well-matured whisky. Until very recently, you could only get Lagavulin as a 16-year-old or older. And again, that added age in Lagavulin tends to tone down and subdue some of the flavours, as well as the 43% bottling strength. And for that reason, I would say that Ardbeg is a more intensely flavoured whisky than Lagavulin as well. Of course, the extra 6 years that you get on a Lagavulin 16 compared to an Ardbeg 10 do add some other things. Old age is a wonderful thing in single malt whisky, and it adds a lot more to the Lagavulin 16-year-old if you're into those things. I personally am, but in terms of intensity and fun and sheer enjoyment, I think the Ardbeg probably has it over the Lagavulin as well. The thing about Ardbeg 10 is that I think it has an almost magical balance of youthful, peaty intensity and complexity and maturity from those 10 years. I'm just going to finish this now because it's absolutely lovely. So what about comparing Ardbeg 10-year-old to other whiskies? What else is it sort of similar to? Now, I think that Ardbeg is quite a unique whisky, but if you were to say that it's like anything else, I would say that on Islay you've got Bruichladdich, Port Charlotte and Caol Ila. Now, both of those distilleries produce whisky which is generally fairly available and affordable, very high quality, and to be fair, almost as peaty as Ardbeg. Outside of Islay, I would say you've got Annock, made by Knockdhu Distillery, and actually the English Whisky Company as well. Both of those distilleries are making incredible, young, heavily peated, really intense, flavoursome single malts. And if you like Ardbeg, I'd definitely give those two a good look as well. I think it is important to talk about alternatives to Islay whisky, especially when you look at the price and limited availability of some of the special editions of Ardbeg. If you don't like having to pay through the nose and constantly be frustrated by missing out with your special editions of Islay whisky, maybe it's time to try something else. especially when the secondary market is your only option of obtaining a special release from Islay. If you see someone that's clearly bought a bottle and they've instantly flipped it to make a huge profit, just do yourself and everyone else a favour and just don't pay it, because it's really not our only option these days when you're talking about peated whisky. But as for the Ardbeg 10-year-old, while it's still available, and unless the price starts to creep up, I would say that this one is an absolute classic in my books.